This is my storage server. There are many like it, but this one is mine. Howdy folks, how are y'all doing? My name is Reese, and today I wanted to take a look inside of my storage server because I feel like there might be some people out there who could find it interesting to walk down memory lane with me. This is not a server that I purchased. I mean, I bought all the parts inside of it, but it's been cobbled together over the years, and in fact, I don't think that until today, I've got some things we're going to be putting in there, but I don't think that anything that is inside of this server was purchased with the idea of it ever going in this server. It's just how things have happened. You know what it's like. You build your first computer, and a decade later you have all these parts. Every idea that you have, every problem you can't solve, just throw a computer at it. Just build the computer. The process is fun, and it's relaxing, and when you're done, who cares if it doesn't work? Take it apart, do it again, because the building computers is love and life. That's what we've got inside of here. We've got an amalgamation of parts, and I'm going to be walking you through why they're in here and what we're doing with them and what we're changing. So I guess the first thing we should talk about is why I have a storage server. I don't make tech YouTube videos. That is why this is terrible. I've got like one camera here pointed at the actual thing. I've got one up there. Howdy, how you doing? I don't really do this often. I make gaming videos, and I make a lot of them, and starting in 2012, I decided that I would store every second of captured footage in addition to the raw videos, because before, once the video was made and uploaded, I scrapped all that. Even the actual finished video, which I regret now, because, boy, YouTube's compression just doesn't make a video look good, you know? You can re-download it, either in the back end at 720p or through other methods at, you know, the full 4K quality, but that's just not quite the same as that file you exported, and I would like to have the original file. So I can't go back and get those for older videos, but starting in 2020, I've hoarded every video I've made. And the raw footage, just in case I need video game footage for a video idea. I don't want to have to go back and replay a game if I already played 100 hours of it and have it all captured. You know, it might come in handy. And it's been nice to go back and make little clips and shorts and things using those raw files. I've done that quite a bit, just whenever an idea hits me. But this is my storage server. It did not start with the intention of being that. So let's crack it open. Let's talk about what's inside of here. I'm not sure if I can really move the thing around in such a way that you can see up front here, but this is a rose wheel case. They've got a few different models similar to this. I bought this one. If you can see inside there without me hitting my microphone, it does need to be dusted. But it's got 12 drive bays. These are the rose wheel. I think they are. Actually, they might not be. Let me think on that for a minute. I don't think I bought the rose wheel. Yeah, that's right. Okay, you can buy this case without the hot swap bays for quite a bit less. And then I went to eBay and bought some, like, you know, Chinese knockoff bays and stuck those in there. I'll have the name of the case in the description, or maybe on the screen. I don't know. This is awful. We're moving on. So if I'm being honest with you, right now there are no drives in here, but before that, for its current configuration, and I gotta stress that because when I built this the first time, there was 12 drives in it, but in its current form, the way I've been using it is with 8 drives in one pool split across 2 RAID Z1 VDEVs in a TrueNAS Core virtual machine running in Unraid. Again, that's not what I set out to do. That's just where we ended up. And we're going to be changing that in the future. But first things first, let's get this thing open. And yeah, you'll notice there's some damage on it up here at the front. And then there's some scratching along the back. No, I don't know how that happened. I think it got caught on something when I was sliding into the cage once. The server rack, I should say. Because it doesn't have rails. And I wanted to add rails today. That was going to be one of the things that I did. But I couldn't swing it. You know, if I wanted to get quality rails, I was looking at a minimum of like $70. I didn't want to go cheap ones. I didn't want to get like flimsy things that would break or bend. And I didn't really want to spend $70 or more. I mean, some of the ones I was seeing that people like actually highly recommended started at like $130. No, not today. So we're going to just keep shoving it in and out of that rack. But let's talk about what's in here. So first off, you'll notice these obviously do not have any kind of backplane. So they are wired up with a series of cables, and that is a bit of a mess, but we do what we have to do to get things done. We're mostly going to be focusing on what is past this line. So yeah, we've got the cages that used to have 8 terabyte drives. I don't know if I mentioned the size. It was 8 terabyte drives spread across 2 RAID Z1 VDEVs for a total of 48 terabytes of storage space. And the reason we're doing this today is because I'm almost out of space. It's at 90% fill. And if you know anything about TrueNAS and ZFS, it does not like that. It's very angry. It wants 80% capacity, no more. It wants that extra 20% to do ZFS things, I suppose. So obviously the easiest thing to do would just be to add 4 more drives, add a whole new VDEV, and carry on. But we're actually doing something dumber than that, so stay tuned. So inside of here, you can see the remnant of what I was talking about with this being a PC built from scraps. Obviously, it's got the fans in the middle, the fans on the back of here as well. It's got this fan that you can barely see on camera that's kind of strapped to this crossbar. And that was because at one point this system had 2 or 3 GPUs in it, and I just wanted to force some extra cooling into it. If you're wondering why, just keep wondering. Some of you might have noticed that this is a funny looking Noctua cooler. This is a Threadripper system, 1st gen 1950X. 16 core, 32 thread, it remains the highest core CPU I've ever owned to date. I think the closest we've gotten before that, up until this point, is 8 core. I have a Ryzen 5800X3D. 1000 watt power supply, obviously, because again, at one point, there's like 3 GPUs in here. I guess I better tell you about the history of everything now. I keep alluding to that. So, I don't remember why I bought this case. And going back, I probably wouldn't buy it again. I actually built a new Plex server last year with a secondhand Supermicro 2U 12-bay server that I really liked. I say server, it was just the case, the actual drive caddies, and a SAS backplane. That thing's great. You just wire up the SAS cable to your HBA and you're done. You don't have to plug in 12 different SATA cables and all that nonsense, all that gubbins. I would do that again if I was starting over, knowing what this system was going to become. But then again, we probably wouldn't be able to get the Threadripper in there. Not with this cooler, as well as most of the expansion cards I have in here. So that would be a pretty compromised system. But that's the kind of case style I like now, where I don't really have to do anything to get the drives like all individually wired in. I pop them out, plug them back in, and I've got 2 SAS cables hooked up to mine. It'll do up to 4, but I don't think that's a speed thing. I think that's like a redundancy thing, so just went with 2. This is not that. This was the first thing I'd ever built in a server-style case that would go into a server rack. I didn't even have a server rack when I purchased this. Well, I did, but I built one myself out of wood, like, you know, a caveman. It was a good little rack, though. It worked for a couple of years before my dear friend Trace located someone selling an actual real server rack semi-locally. And we just went and bought that secondhand, and that's been really cool to have as well. I would never have bought one of those new, but this was one of those, we need this out of here now. $100 for a full server rack with the doors and everything. I was so excited. And then I finally had a place to put this mess. So let's get to it. I assume I bought the case to do a storage server. I think there was a storage server in here before this was in here. The Threadripper processor I got a couple of years back, probably longer. It was probably pre-20... It was probably 2019, now that I'm thinking about it. Threadripper, I'm pretty sure 3000 was out or announced, and it felt like first-gen Threadripper was just on a fire cell. So I got the motherboard that's in here and the 1950X at what I thought was a steal, and I was using it for a capture PC. I really wanted the 1950X, or really any Threadripper part, but I waited until the 1950X was reasonable because I wanted the PCIe lanes. This thing has 64 PCIe lanes, and that means you can add a ton of expansion. And at the time, I had this crazy capture PC that had, I want to say, maybe 1 or 2 GPUs. Again, I build so many systems that now it's hard to remember what I've actually built in the past, but I'm pretty sure maybe 1 GPU, and then it had 3 capture cards, so 4 cards total, and then something else. I can't remember what. It doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, you needed a bunch of PCIe lanes to get it working. Oh, a USB card. I think that's what it was. That's right, because we determined that our issue was that we just didn't have enough PCIe lanes, so that's why USB devices kept dropping out, because the chipset was being overwhelmed. Kind of the excuse that I made up to justify getting a Threadripper processor, but We didn't have that issue anymore after that, and I know it wasn't that motherboard because I went on to use it in other systems, and it was fine. I really do think we just needed more PCIe lanes. We were putting too much strain on the 24 that you got on your general consumer processing platform. So 64 lanes Threadripper, and then from there, it just got wacky. At one point, I quit YouTube for about 6 months with the intention of never coming back, and I just ripped the Threadripper system apart. I put it in here, and I was like, let's try Unraid just for fun, you know? So, yeah, this system is running Unraid. Not after today, but there's my Unraid drive. A little Samsung drive here. I do have plans for this. I'm going to be using Unraid on something different. We're foregoing it here. But I just bought an Unraid license. I was using this for, that's right, just general storage. That's why I got the case. So I guess the case always had Threadripper. But Threadripper was never purchased to go in a server. It was meant to be a capture PC. But when I came back to doing YouTube, the Threadripper was inside my server. What could I do? So I found the old capture PC SSD, plugged it in here, plugged in a GPU, enabled pass-through for a VM, you know, with that drive, and it just booted into Windows. So I had my old capture PC back with a capture card, a GPU, and an NVMe storage device, all passed through directly, MMOIU, all that good stuff. What is it? MMOIU? No. IOMMU. That's gotta be it. Anyway, we had direct pass-through. Capture machine worked great. Stuck another GPU in here. Started using that for like just transcoding things. I had a watch folder set up in a Docker container on Unraid with some program. I can't remember what it was called, but it just ran in Docker, and I could drop things into this watch folder. It would transcode it based on some predefined rules, and then spit it out the other side, delete the old one. It was really cool. And then eventually I moved on back to having a dedicated capture PC because I realized having everything in one system is a bit of a pain. If something goes down, like let's say the storage stops working because you have a weird Unraid problem, because at the time I was doing all of my storage with Unraid, or you need to swap out components, well, now you're out your server and your capture PC. And if it's one of those things where you have to take it apart and figure out what's wrong, and it might take a couple days for parts to come in, well, you're down 2 computers during that time. So I spun out all the capture PC stuff to its own system, and we got silly. We installed TrueNAS Core. I'd never used TrueNAS before, except on a backup computer that I configured and never touched again. So all of this backed up to that system. I was like, you know what? We're gonna daily drive it. We're gonna take it for a spin because I was having some issues with Unraid anyway. That weird drive kept dropping in and out, and it didn't really seem to be related to any hardware. Although I think now that it was related to some hardware. I just decided to go to TrueNAS. So running TrueNAS in a VM on Unraid, that's where we are today. We have a 1,000-watt power supply in here because I needed that when I had a bunch of GPUs in it. We have a Threadripper because I just stuck that in there for fun because I was done doing YouTube and I didn't need it in here anymore. And then all of this down here is kind of necessary. These are parts that were put in here as it became a general storage server where I now store all of my YouTube videos. So going from top to bottom, 4 of the 5 slots are filled. We have this GPU here. This is the Radeon Pro MX 5100. This is in here for no reason other than the fact that I needed a GPU to get the thing to boot. Well, maybe not. It might be able to run headless. I never actually tested. The first time I tried to get this thing to set up, I needed to actually be able to see the BIOS and go through the initial setup steps. There's no IPMI on this board. It's not a server board. That's just how I'm using it. So I needed a GPU. I stuck that one in there and just left it because I figured if I ever needed to do any kind of troubleshooting or anything like that, I'd rather just be able to plug in a video cable and see exactly what's going on, as opposed to having to pull the whole thing out and then stick a video card in there and then plug in a cable and see what was going on. So I might replace this. I'd like to replace it with something that uses less power. I actually have a 4100, a WX 4100. I own these because they were compatible with old-style Mac Pros, which I have a couple of. Again, just picked them up semi-recently on the secondhand market because I thought they'd be fun to play around with, and they really were. But I'm not using them anymore. They just use too much power even at idle. So as fun as they were to kind of mess around with, Unless, you know, we get to a point where we have bountiful free energy or very cheap energy, like, you know, if we actually start building nuclear power plants, I'm not going to be able to afford to just run those on the daily. Below that, we have our HBA. I'll have to check the model number. I think it's an LSI card. I got it online, flashed to IT mode already, so all I had to do was plug in the SAS cables, and there's a couple of different ones there, but they're both your basic 8087 to 4 SATA. And you'll notice that one of these goes to the blue cables here, if you can see them, like, you know, your normal SAS situation would. Some of these are red, and some of them go back to this little board. So remember I told you I had some kind of weird hardware issue? Well, I never definitively proved it, but I think that the SATA controller on the motherboard was either going bad or one of the ports was flaking out, because I just kept having drives disappear. And it seemed random. And it wasn't until I really dug down and figured it out, it wasn't random. It was drives that were specifically connected to the motherboard. 8 of them were connected to the HBA, and still are, but then 4 of them were connected to the board, and just had weird issues. And I could never figure out, because it was always a different drive, the only common factor being that they were all plugged into the motherboard's controller. So I stuck this cheap SATA 4-port card in there, and it's worked fine. I suppose at the end of the day, TrueNAS has never been upset about it. You know, it gets all the information it needs from the drives. But that's something we're going to be swapping out today. But then we have the final thing. Down here at the bottom, this long silver card is a 5 SATA M.2 drive. I think that's next generation form factor in GFF versus NVMe. 5 of those in a single little blade for, I think it's 2 terabytes each, so 10 terabytes of SSD storage space. At the time I got that, because this is another one of those things, like actually everything else in here, wasn't purchased with the intention of going into this system. It was purchased for something else, but it just kind of got passed down and ended up in this bottom slot, configured in a RAID Z1 for 8 terabytes of SSD storage that I just use for some files. Things that, yeah, well, the problem with SSDs is that they degrade over time when you write to them, not so much when you read. So things that I want to hold on to, but that I'll never need to do anything other than read again. So like old thumbnails from videos and things of that nature, right? Like video files are huge, so I keep those on the spinning disks. But on the SSDs, things like the actual Affinity photo documents, all the individual thumbnails, all of Kevin MacLeod's music library from incomptech.com. Thank you, by the way, Kevin MacLeod, for enabling YouTubers for over a decade now. It's very, very much appreciated. But let's get to what we're changing in here. So first things first, this is a SAS expander. This is cool. So this allows you to take 1 or 2 ports from your HBA, and it spits out 4 additional ones over here. Now, these are 8087 connectors, like these here, and they just get plugged in right there. There we go. And then they go out to the HBA. Now, according to everything I've read on the internet, you don't actually have to connect both of these up to the HBA. You only need to connect one of them up. What I'm unsure about is whether or not connecting up both of them would increase your throughput, or just act as redundancy, some kind of load balancing. Blow it up? I'm unsure. But what we're doing is we're going to keep that HBA in there, and then we're going to install this in place of this SATA card. This way, instead of having some things plugged in via an HBA and some things being plugged in through a completely separate card, they'll all be going along the same route. Is that important? Probably not. It's never seemed to have any issues, but I figured we might as well do it, because at least this way we can have all of these wired up to the exact same spot. And we'll actually have an extra spot, an extra slot here where we could add 4 more drives, but I don't know where. There's not room. But we could if we wanted to. And in case you were curious, that is what an 8087 connection looks like. The next thing we'll be adding is this card. This card is similar to an HBA in that it is a host bus adapter, but its ports are on the outside. So instead of using 8087, this will use an 8088 connector, which I believe is this side. Yes, and it does matter because this side is different. This end plugs into the NetApp disk shelf that I also found here locally for a pretty decent price. That's going to add an additional 24 drive bays to this system externally. It just plugs in down there, and the disk shelf has its own power, and I think we might need to use 2 of these. Here's the thing, it has 2 separate controllers, but I can't tell if, again, that's a thing where you have to wire them both in Do you daisy chain them one to the other? Does having two provide redundancy? I'm using SATA, so without in some kind of an interposer, we wouldn't be able to get redundancy anyway. You'd need SAS drives for that. I only need half the slots to work, so I'm hoping that just plugging one of them in will do the job for us. But this is so we can add more drives in the future, but also so we can copy the data off of the drives that were in here to the new drives. We'll get to that in a second. Finally, now that we've pulled Unraid out of the system, we're going to be installing TrueNAS Scale, not Core, but Scale. I've enjoyed Scale quite a bit recently, so we're going to be using that directly to the system to one of these Optane drives. And I've got 4 of them because one of them, well, hold on, one is a 16 gig. That's not the one we're using. We'll be installing the operating system to the 32 gig drive. It's only PCIe Gen 3x2. Not super fast. Fast enough, though. And for a boot drive, this is going to take no time to boot up. Like, the operating system isn't going to be the slow part. A lot of these add-in cards are, because they like to have their own little boot menus that you can go into and access their settings and change things, but this is plenty fast for boot. Once it's loaded to memory, it's barely going to be touching this, and it is going to outlast every other component in the system because it's its own special thing that Intel destroyed because they don't know how to manage their company. I do have 2 more drives. These are 56 gigs each. I think 58, my bad, my mistake. These are 58 gig drives. They are NVMe Gen 3x4. And before you say, why not Gen 4 and why not Gen 5, this board only supports Gen 3 anyway. And I don't think Optane ever made the jump past Gen 3. Because again, it was cruelly and mercilessly murdered by Intel. But I've got these to act as a ZFS intent log, or a ZIL, I think, which should help speed up sequential writes. I don't really know if I understand how ZIL works well enough to explain it. My understanding is that it won't necessarily make the process of writing data faster. It'll just make the process of allocating the space for the data quicker. These aren't going to make the system go faster than what your disks in whatever like pool configuration you have would allow. But if both of these fail, it's not really any major loss except for the data being written to the pool. We might lose that data, it might be corrupted, it might stop the transfer, but the data on the drives are fine. And that's what I'll be installing today. Now, I mentioned new drives. The plan for this system changed pretty dramatically after ordering a few new disks to add, when I decided that I would try to bring that disk shelf online and get it working. And then we could add 12 whole drives, 4 more in here and 8 down there, and have 3 new VDEVs. How fun. But then I realized that, I really don't like RAID Z1. Even with just 4 disks, if one disk goes out, boy, are you sitting on tenterhooks waiting for that thing to rebuild, hoping another disk in that same VDEV doesn't fail. The way that TrueNAS works using ZFS is you have your storage pool. And we're going to simplify this and say you just have the one. So that storage pool is not made up of a bunch of individual disks. Rather, it's made up of a VDEV. I think VDEV stands for virtual device or virtual drive, even though it's dev and not DRV. But it's a virtual collection of disks. So this system is one pool made up of 2 VDEVs. Each of those VDEVs is made up of a RAID Z configuration. And the RAID Zs are pretty simple. You got just RAID Z mirror, which is like it's like RAID 1, I guess, where all the data on one disk is also on the other. It's an exact mirror of one another. You have RAID Z stripe, which is similar to RAID 0. So the data is striped across both disks. Each disk has half your data, and if one dies, you lose everything. And then you have RAID Z1, RAID Z2, RAID Z3. RAID Z, or as it's also called RAID Z1, they're the same thing, has 1 redundant disk. So however many drives are in that VDEV, whether it be 3, 4, 5, 8, 12, you don't want to go that high, but if one of those disks dies, all of your data is still intact on that VDEV, and if you can get it out and swap in a new one and rebuild parity, you'll be fine. RAID Z2 is the same thing as RAID Z or RAID Z1, except with 2 redundant disks. RAID Z3 is the same with 3 redundant disks. The number at the end denotes how many disks worth of redundancy you have. So remember, with this system, I have 8 8TB drives in 2 VDEVs making up one pool. So in this system, I could have 1 drive per VDEV fail, and all of my data would still be there. I do have a system backup. So remember that TrueNAS backup server that I have? I just did some more work on it, actually. I expanded its storage, installed a fresh TrueNAS Scale. I'm really liking Scale quite a bit. And made sure the backup was up to date in here. That's set up with RAID Z2. And so there's already a bit more redundancy in the backup. But I wanted to go ahead and add a bit more redundancy here. Redundancy itself is not a backup. But I've got better redundancy in my backup than I do in my actual system. And that felt wrong. So what I'm going to be doing instead is I've taken out all 8 drives that were inside of this system. I'm installing 12 new drives, and I'm configuring that in a single pool with 2 RAID Z2 VDEVs. So each VDEV will have 6 drives each, 2 of which will be dedicated to parity, except that's not really how it works. It's not like Unraid where there are dedicated parity drives. Parity is striped across all of the disks. But when I say dedicated parity, I mean 2 of them could die and would be okay, right? So there'll be 4 drives in each VDEV for storage. 4 times 8 is 32, times 2 is 64 terabytes of total storage space. And 32 gigs in the other 4 drives just lost to the aether. But my old drives, this is where I feel like I'm being very clever and careful, okay? And very wise, and you should all give me kudos for this. Rather than doing the dumb thing of adding 4 more drives, deleting everything, you know, creating a new pool exactly the way I just described, and then restoring everything from my backup, which is the only source of my data, so if something happens to my backup during that, all my data is gone. Datas? Why not? Instead, I pulled the 8 drives out, set them up 1 in a row in a safe location, and there's a second copy of all my data. So now what I'm going to do is put the 12 new drives in here, create the new pool, and then put those 8 drives that I already have with all my data on it into the NetApp expansion chassis that I've got, you know, hook it up to here. I exported that system so I can just import it now. I've got the key saved and everything. And then I'll have the old pool, the new pool, and the backup. And then instead of restoring over the network, I can restore almost natively, piping all the data down this pipe from the 8 old drives to the 12 new drives, and then I can use 6 of those old drives in a third VDEV for this system. And yes, you can expand ZFS like that. You just have to add new VDEVs that are the same storage size as your old ones. So you don't actually need the same number of disks. Each VDEV just needs to come out to the same number of, in this case, terabytes. So each of these with the 4 8-terabyte drives, remember there's 6 in each VDEV, but only 4 of them worth of data storage. Each of those is 32 terabytes. I could get 2 16-terabyte drives in a stripe and add that if I wanted to as a VDEV, and I wouldn't have any issues other than, you know, that's a horrible idea, having those 2 drives like that. Because if either of those fails, the entire thing's wiped out, kind of. Because it's not going to rebalance itself. ZFS doesn't quite work like that. If you were to add a new VDEV, it's not going to copy some of the data off of the old ones. Rather, just when you write new things, it'll go exclusively to that VDEV until it's the same fill capacity. Like, let's say these are 70% full. When that VDEV hits 70% full, it'll go back to kind of striping the data across all the VDEVs. But you could do that. I could do the same thing with 3 drives in a RAID Z1, 3 16-terabyte drives in a RAID Z1. Or 4 of them in a mirror, but not like a 4-way mirror, more like 2 drives in a mirror and then striped. What I'm trying to get at is there's a lot of different ways to approach this. What I'm going to do first, though, is I'm going to get all of the new components installed in here, get it booted up with the new TrueNAS Scale installer, check all of the drives, make sure they're in good, healthy working order, all of the new drives, build the pool, test the pool over the network, make sure we're getting the kind of speeds and performance we are anticipating. And only after doing all that will I plug in the disk shelf, make sure that it can recognize the original drives. I might actually test with some different drives. That seems wise. Rather than plugging, you know, those 8 drives that make up the storage pool that I want to import into this new system to copy over to the new pool. Let's put some different drives in there and just make sure it sees them and doesn't cause them to catch on fire and melt. Because I've not tested that disk shelf yet. That is a thing that could reasonably happen. In my mind, all kinds of horrible things could happen. I could hit the power button and some kind of demon could crawl out of the back and tell me, if you want your data back, you have to sacrifice to me. I don't know. Until you try, you just have no clue what's going to happen. Probably not that. But we're not going to know till we do it. But for now, I'm feeling dehydrated and I need to go get water. And no, this isn't going into a sponsorship. I just realized it sounded a lot like that, but no one's sponsoring this. Why would they?